really happy to introduce Andrew Jorgenson today. Dr. Jorgenson is professor and chair in the Department of Sociology and professor of environmental studies at Boston College. Previously, he's held faculty positions at Washington State University, North Carolina State University, and the University of Utah, where he was my dissertation chair. And on his website, it says, much of Dr. Jorgenson's work is done in collaboration with his current and former graduate students. And I can vouch for that and say that Andrew is an amazing mentor, a very generous academic mentor, and so I'm really happy to have him here today. So just a little bit of background on Andrew. He's a highly successful scholar in our field. He has made both theoretical and especially methodological contributions to macro-comparative environmental sociology and interdisciplinary research on climate change. So just a very brief sort of summary of his research. He studies the human dimensions of global environmental change, focusing on the anthropogenic drivers of greenhouse gas emissions, energy consumption, industrial pollution, and land cover change. He also studies nations' political, economic, and environmental conditions that shape health disparities, uneven development, and income inequality. And he's also conducted research on the global dimensions of environmental concern, and I worked on that with him. And he's currently working on a project that has received multiple waves of NSF funding on disproportionality in the emissions from global power plants. And he has a book on that coming out in 2019. He's published in places like Nature Climate Change, Environmental Research Letters, Sustainability Science. The list is too long. You'd be very bored listening to me list them all. His research has received widespread media coverage. He's also been a real leader in the discipline of sociology. He's been the chair of both the environmental section and the sociology of development section. And he co-founded the Journal of Sociology of Development. And he has a leadership role in the Society for Human Ecology. So in addition to all those long list of intimidating accomplishments, Andrew is just a really nice person. So I hope you enjoyed his talk. And get a chance to maybe
thank God.
Thanks.
No, thanks. No, thanks. Well, thank you for that. It's really special for me to have Jennifer introduce me. I'm really proud of her. It's really neat to come here and see what she's up to at Utah State and to meet a lot of her colleagues and all the amazing students that I've had the privilege of spending time with today and later today and tomorrow. It's really been a lot of fun. You're all doing really cool stuff. I love the idea behind the Ecology Center. That's what we should be doing, bringing folks together across different disciplines that are interested in all sorts of socio-ecological kinds of relationships and sustainability questions. And so when I was asked to come and visit, I was thrilled. I have roots in Utah. I was born in Salt Lake. I was an undergrad at that other university down there. Don't hate me for it. I love your canyon. I've spent time. It's amazing to see how much Logan has changed through the years. So it's really neat to be back here, and it's been a lot of fun. I hope you'll find this interesting. I'm not going to talk much in this discussion today about my own research. This is really kind of a show and tell about what environmental sociology is and how we do what we do and the tools that we use. Because I think hopefully you'll see that a lot of the tools that we use to pursue the different sorts of questions that we ask overlap hopefully a lot with the tools that we use in our sort of sister disciplines. We have this sort of shared set toolbox, I think. I think sometimes we call these tools different things, but hopefully you'll see that, oh, so you all use that technique. That's very similar to a technique we use. We just call it something different. And I've done this before, and it worked out. I gave a talk like this to a group of graduate students and postdocs, mainly in ecology a few years ago, and it was a lot of fun. And I really got a lot out of it, too, in terms of the questions that folks asked and kind of the reactions like, yeah, we do that, too. We just call it something different. So for selfish reasons, I thought it would be fun to talk about this. So also, too, what in the world is environmental sociology? People ask me that. It's okay. Most folks have no idea what we do. My parents still don't know what I do. That's fine. I have had this conversation a lot with folks in the media that will call me, say, yeah, you just published this article. You're a sociologist? You're an environmental sociologist? What is that? So I guess the first thing is what is environmental sociology? And I want this to be interactive because I know there are other environmental sociologists in the room. So I want to know, what is environmental sociology? Sociology friends? Anyone? It's not a trick question, I promise. We have these formal definitions. Does anyone want to? You can keep it simple.
Andrew's looking right at me, so I think
I'm looking over this way because I recognize some sociology folks over here. I'm not trying to, or those that are not in sociology, does anyone want to take a stab at it that's not in sociology? Like, what is environmental sociology? Or what's CHANS? We all do CHANS. We all talk about CHANS, right? Coupled human natural systems stuff. And the definition of that. To me, the definition of that is very similar to the definition of what environmental sociology is. It's just us kind of doing socio-environmental work through the lens of our discipline of sociology, from our analytical perspectives, our theoretical perspectives. I'm not going to talk much about theory today. I'm happy to if folks want to. I'll talk more about theory tomorrow. But we're studying human-environment relationships at multiple scales, how we impact the environment at the individual level, at the household level, at the organizational level, at the institutional level, at the nation-state level, at the global level, how the natural environment shapes social change. For those of you that aren't familiar with our discipline, though, environmental sociology, we're kind of small in our discipline. If you look at the history of our discipline, we don't have a really good track record in sociology historically of how we've treated the environment. I think we've gotten a lot better. If you look at the origins of our discipline, we were sort of resistant to thinking about how the natural world shaped human society, which is nonsense. I mean, it is. And we sort of admit that now in sociology, or most of us do, that, yeah, the natural world, the changing natural conditions shape what we do, how we act, the decisions we can make. And also, oh, by the way, we impact the natural world. I tend to focus on the latter part, how we impact the natural world, but while also considering, though, how those environmental changes in turn then influence future decisions or things that we may or may not do, collectively or individually. I'm a macro sociologist, too, so more terminology. So I tend to take a very global-ish approach to the work that I've done, but not all sociology is like this. And most of the time, when I talk to folks and I say, yeah, I'm a sociologist, like, oh, you must do public opinion research, because that's what sociologists do. Yeah, a lot of sociologists do that kind of stuff. That's not what I do. But a lot of work is like that. Or, oh, you must interview folks or go and do field work. That's not what I do, but a lot of sociological work does those things. And I'll talk about how environmental sociologists use those methods with some applied examples. In terms of how we think about doing research, I'm pretty dry and boring about this. How do we decide what methods we're going to use? Very simply, I believe in the approach of you let your research questions help determine what your appropriate research design is. You don't have your favorite methods and then have that shape what your research questions are. That can make your life harder throughout your career, especially when you get later in your career and you were trained a while ago, and methods change, practices change, norms change, expectations change. So I've had to learn new methods throughout my career, which is fun, can be frustrating sometimes. A lot of the work that we do is exploratory. A lot of it is hypothesis testing. So we do deductive stuff. We do inductive stuff. I hate this sort of false dichotomy between the two. I think a lot of really good social science research or sociological work is somewhere on this continuum, and we bounce back and forth. So I do a lot of hypothesis testing, but a lot of it's inductive too. It's not purely deductive. So I don't like those false kinds of... I think they're false. Not everyone thinks they're false. Units of analyses. They're all over the place. One of the things that hopefully you'll leave from this lecture, discussion, whatever you want to call this is, wow, sociologists study a lot of different things. Everything is fair game to a certain extent. And our units of analyses vary from the individual all the way to the global and everything in between. And oftentimes we combine those, because one of the fundamental principles of our discipline, I think, is context matters. Context really matters. And it can be context at multiple scales. That drives a lot of my colleagues in other disciplines nuts when I keep pointing out, but what about the context of this thing or that thing? And one of the ways in which we get at context is by nesting different units of analyses and also conducting analyses through time. Time really matters. Time itself is an important context. A lot of sociology is kind of presentist. A lot of social science is relatively presentist. I was trained by sociologists that are, by our disciplinary standards, to the extreme of thinking about time. That history really matters. Social change can be long-term. Some of it can be short-term. But then I hang out with archaeologists, and they're like, you have no idea what time is. Like, your sense of time, which really sort of changes things a bit. So that's really fun. So we primarily, a lot of us analyze primary data, a lot of us analyze secondary data. Sometimes it's a combination of the two. Most of the work that I do is the analysis of secondary data. So a lot of the things that I study, I can't use experimental methods. A lot of the things that I study are kind of depressing. I probably wouldn't want to use experimental methods for ethical reasons, given some of the things that I study. But that can make hypothesis testing and the rigor of your work kind of challenging, of course. So a lot of us try to employ different techniques or a combination of techniques to do more rigorous research given the constraints of our data and what we're studying and the conditions in which we're studying things. I'm guessing to all of you this is probably like, well, yeah, of course. You combine social data and environmental or ecological data. This still kind of freaks out a lot of sociologists. It's changing. It doesn't freak them out as much as they used to, which I think is great. But it is one of the things that a lot of us try to do when we're studying socio-environmental relationships. And as an environmental sociologist, that's one of the things that I often do. Combining social or data sets on social data and ecological and environmental data. And this can get really challenging. To me, as a sociologist, nation states matter for a variety of sociological reasons. But I've had conversations with colleagues in other disciplines, and we're very interested in similar topics, and they're like, why are you, this is a global problem. You're studying global climate change. Why are you doing this comparative international thing? Why are you paying attention to nation states? Well, because these boundaries that you see on maps are really important. There's a history behind them. There are deeply embedded institutions that are tied to these that really matter in terms of how anthropogenic climate change has been occurring and also what we can do about it, for example. But it can get really messy because CO2 doesn't follow nation-state boundaries. A lot of the things that we study don't. And I know I'm preaching to the choir to many of you in the room that are more on the ecological side of things in terms of if you're studying non-human species, how you deal with these geographical boundaries. And I've learned a lot from folks the last couple of days here that are doing that kind of work. It's amazing how you gather your data. It's really cool. Measurement matters to us too. And I have a slide that I think in simplistic terms illustrates how something as simple as how you measure carbon emissions in different ways for different nations, things look really different. And for a lot of the work that I and my colleagues do, these different ways of approaching measuring the same sort of general thing have all sorts of theoretical implications and policy implications and practical implications. So I want to underscore that point too. And I kind of like this stuff, and so a few years ago, like other social science disciplines, sociologists got together and said, we study climate change too. And we got together in kind of a formal way and had a task force for the American Sociological Association. Dozens of folks that study climate change from a sociological perspective in a variety of ways got together. It was a big organizational challenge because there was so much interest in this. And we did a bunch of white papers and published this book that I think is a pretty good overview of much, but not all, of the kinds of ways in which sociologists study climate change. And it's also really focusing on work done by scholars in the US because it was authored by sociologists that are affiliated with the American Sociological Association, if you're interested. And I co-authored a chapter on methods, and it was fun. So I kind of like thinking about these things, these sorts of challenges. So I'm just going to walk through and talk about some different methods that we use and show you some examples that I think are pretty cool and pretty interesting. I'm a bit biased. I've cherry-picked some examples from colleagues, current and former students, using some of these different techniques, asking a variety of different kinds of socio-environmental questions that are sociologically grounded. And hopefully you'll see that the methods and tools that we're using overlap a lot with the methods and tools that you are using, or you might see some methods that you hadn't thought about before. You might think about, or might think that maybe they might be useful to you and your colleagues. So this is sort of breadth, not depth. I'm happy to go into any detail if anyone wants to. And I do want to emphasize, though, these are not necessarily methods that were designed by sociologists, so the title of my talk isn't exactly accurate in that sense. Like ethnography, I think most folks, when they think of the origins of ethnography, we don't necessarily think of sociology, we probably think of anthropology. Even though this is not really one method, it's a suite of methods that are employed by folks across a variety of disciplines, but certainly by sociologists and certainly by environmental sociologists. It's really in-depth, deep dive field work, doing a variety of things. So it's one of the ways in which we do field research. And I think that this gives you a sense of the different sorts of subcomponents of ethnography in terms of what might be employed in doing an ethnography. They tend to take a long time to do well. Has anyone in here done an ethnography or is doing an ethnography? So I'm sure it takes a long time to do well, doesn't it? It's a huge investment. It's hard. I haven't done ethnography. I have a lot of colleagues in my department at Boston College that this is a method or a suite of methods that they use. And it takes a lot of time. You're in the field a long time to do well, to do the work well. So participant observation, interviews, formal interviews, informal interviews, archival work, analyzing documents, using images, all these different sorts of things can be used to do ethnography. Some ethnographies use some of these, others use other versions. There are different versions of ethnography. There's something called relational ethnography. I know of folks that have been working together to do something called a global ethnography, which isn't really a global ethnography. It's combining ethnographies in different places around the world on similar topics to try to understand how certain sorts of processes might be similar or different in different sort of cultural and social contexts. This method really emphasizes the importance of context, big time. And the data tends to be really rich. On the other hand, though, and this isn't a criticism, oftentimes ethnographic research may not be generalizable. But that's not necessarily the point of ethnography, to try to generalize across various cases. So let me tell you about a couple of really cool environmental sociology examples. And I already see some folks nodding their heads, like you've probably seen or heard about Kari Norgaard's amazing ethnography. I'm biased. She's a good friend of mine. This work is amazing. I think it really surprises folks, though. If you haven't read this book, I highly recommend it. So whenever a common thing that folks ask me about too, when they're like, "Oh, you're a sociologist? Tell me about climate change denial," because that's something that sociologists must study, and we do. I don't, but Kari sure does, and this is a rich, detailed study of climate denial in a particular context in Norway, in a community that heavily relies on the skiing industry. I don't want to give away the details. It's a fascinating book, and I highly recommend it. But as you'll see from this brief description, though, she does a lot of things. She spends a lot of time going to events, formal events, informal events, talking to a lot of people, formally and informally, analyzing all sorts of documents. She's also gotten a lot of backlash for this. A lot of nasty emails, a lot of horrible emails, too, for what it's worth. This is a great example of environmental sociology using ethnography. Most climate denial research, though, done by sociologists is survey-based research, though. And that's another reason why I like to use this example, because this provides a kind of depth that those sorts of studies don't. And I think you need both. You need both kinds of approaches to get a deep understanding of something like climate denial. Case studies. I'm so happy that Dan Auerbach is in the room For those of you that don't know Dan, he is a PhD student in sociology at the University of Utah, working on his dissertation using these kinds of methods. So I might embarrass you a little bit because I think your project is really cool. So this is where there might be a deep, deep dive into one case, or some folks might do comparative case studies. And they both have their strengths and their relative weaknesses. This is another kind of research tool where it really emphasizes the importance of context, temporal context for sure. Takes a lot of time. I'm married to a historian. My father-in-law is a historian. We talk a lot about this sort of stuff because they try to encourage, they're like, why don't you do more of this? Because you probably should. And I think they're probably right. We also use those kinds of data too. So a lot of this, though, you might be picturing someone hanging out in the archives somewhere. For sure. Dan has been doing that on a really interesting topic, studying Agent Orange and the Vietnam War, studying some really important archives that are located in some particular places within the US, spending a lot of time reading a lot of dusty documents, trying to make some sense of them. And you should see the look on his face. He's in the weeds, because this is a method where you spend a lot of time in the weeds to do well, I think, most of the time. But sometimes there might be archives, so it's kind of like secondary data analysis. The archives are already there. Sometimes you have to go and find those original documents. Brett Clark, an environmental sociologist down the street at the University of Utah, he's done a lot of this too, and he's created some interesting archives. And oftentimes, though, this can also involve some things that seem a bit ethnographic too, especially if you're doing a deep historical analysis of some kind that also up to the contemporary period you might end up doing some field work that seems quite ethnographic. So there's a lot of richness and a lot of detail in this work. But you're like, show us some cool examples. Okay. I mentioned Brett. And I love to talk about this one because it's collaborative. And I love the story because they were students together. They were grad students together. So it's so cool to talk about this one. So Brian Garreau, a sociologist, coincidentally now we're in the same department, but I liked this book before that. So he studies global environmental governance. That's how he describes his work. And this is out of his dissertation. He was a graduate student at UC Santa Cruz. They grow a lot of strawberries out in that part of the world, if you didn't know it. He was studying the Montreal Protocol, sort of this global, sort of international relations kind of thing in the context of strawberry producers and production in California. Studying a phenomenon, something that's really global and international in scope, though, from the perspective of a particular place and a particular type of agricultural process or commodity within agriculture. It's a great book. What he's doing now, though, because we're in New England together, he is collaborating with his partner, who is an ecologist by training, and they're doing something similar, but in the context of studying climate change denial among cranberry farmers in New England, because we have a lot of cranberry bogs. It's multi-method, studying a global, somewhat of a global phenomenon, but sort of denial about a global phenomenon by spending a lot of time with cranberry farmers in New England. Climate change is going to affect their livelihoods. It is already. And their thoughts about this are very mixed. It's really interesting stuff. I'm sure they'll have a book in a year or two. So the three sociologists, they're all sociologists. They went to graduate school at University of Oregon. Stefano is from Sicily. I think he was born in Sicily. He was raised primarily in New York, but he spent a lot of time in Sicily. That's part of the story, I promise. Rebecca, she goes by Becky Clausen, spent a lot of time in Alaska on the fishing boats off the coast of Alaska. Brett grew up in North Dakota. They went to grad school together, University of Oregon. And I think it's safe to say they had a lot of great conversations in graduate school together. And I think that the idea for this project on a global issue, a global sustainability challenge, a fundamental socio-environmental type of sustainability challenge, evolved from conversations they started having in graduate school. Then they started doing the work after they all graduated and got fancy jobs in different places. So it's an in-depth case study, but with a lot of really sort of place and context-specific data, but on a global phenomenon. So it's deeply historical and contemporary at the same time. And they have a theory that they've developed too. This is a really neat book. Students, when I've taught with this book, students love it. It's probably, for those of you that study fisheries, it might be a new spin on a different way of thinking about fisheries. It has sort of a global political economy, deeply historical way of thinking about this. But again, context really matters. That's a big part of their story. So these two, I think, are really interesting environmental sociology examples of case study research. There are many others, but I just wanted to pick a few. So quantitative methods. And I want to, for those of you that I've been hanging out with, know I am lousy with time management, and I even forgot to start my stopwatch. So I'm starting it late. I apologize. So I'll try to keep this, okay. So we use a lot of different regression techniques, like a lot of folks, I'm sure, in the room, and across a variety of disciplines. And so, yeah, depending on our units of analyses, how our dependent variable is measured, we might use linear models, we might use nonlinear models of different kinds. We have these different names for them. Some of these techniques have multiple names. I realize that. Some of them are preferred by, I haven't gotten to the list. I have like a laundry list of different methods on the next slide. Okay. So I'm sure that some of this, though, is like really basic stuff, but I just want to put that up there. So, by the way, I think null findings are really interesting. And I think some of the, what we want to do, though, is obviously minimize the risk of this stuff. Type 1 and type 2 errors. The importance of measurement, the importance of trying to analyze appropriate representative data sets, and also using the appropriate modeling techniques to do the best that we possibly can. And I always forget who made this, and I was talking to someone earlier about this, but that famous saying, all models are wrong, but many are useful. I know there are different versions of this. And yeah, it's like we try to do the best we possibly can, using inferential statistics, probability theory, all that kind of stuff. And it's really cool is in a lot of the conversations I've had with students working on different projects and different programs on campus, a lot of you are using different versions of these techniques. It's been really neat to hear about the different sorts of projects that you're using. We were talking about SEM over lunch today, and it was fun. And it was really neat to hear about how students in ecology are thinking about using SEM for the projects that they're working on. So let me give you just a couple examples of environmental sociologists using some of these techniques, including some folks in this room. I already talked about this. This one, I think, is interesting. There's so many different names for this. Survival analysis, Cox regression, event history analysis. Are there any others I'm missing? Failure time analysis. Analyzing non-repeatable events. A lot of health research use this. You can usually only die once. It's great for analyzing treaty ratification, too. And so you might see an example of that. Okay. But before that, though, something sort of simple, what I mentioned before about measurement. I'll use this slide in environmental studies courses or environmental sociology courses, and it's amazing how long I like to talk about this stuff. So just the same data that a lot of us analyze, just national level anthropogenic CO2 emissions from the burning of fossil fuels and the manufacture of cement. You can download this and replicate this in like 5 minutes from the World Development Indicators. It's those data. or commonly referred to as production-based CO2 measures, not consumption-based, not carbon embodied in trade, which is also really important, I'll talk about later. But there are a variety of different ways in which, at different scales, we can analyze something like anthropogenic CO2. And so, for those of you in the back, I know I'm sorry for how small this is, but this is just from 1960 to 2010, Brazil, China, India, and the US. Total CO2, per capita CO2, and CO2 per unit of GDP. Things look different. They look different. And there's a lot of reasons why. And I realize there's a lot of folks in this room that study why these things look so different. And sociologists do too. And how and why they're different is really important. And then also we have cumulative emissions, which I think is what the atmosphere probably cares about most. It sounds pretty snarky, but I'll say it. I don't think the atmosphere really cares about this one, emissions per unit of GDP. But a lot of us do for a lot of important reasons. Research reasons, policy reasons, all sorts of reasons. But in the context of climate change, I think it's probably, they're all important. But I think this one's really important. I think they're all actually important. My favorite one, if I had to pick one, is probably this one. Some of you might be going, oh, darn, why not this one or this one? I think they're all important, though. But just measurement really matters. So depending on if you're analyzing the effects of development on carbon emissions, how you measure carbon emissions across these 3 or 4 different ways, your results might look really different, and oftentimes they do. Okay. A pioneering study within sociology for a couple of reasons was published by York et al. In the American Sociological Review back in 2003. This is about the time when folks were really excited about this thing called the ecological footprint. Did anyone go through a phase where they were really excited about the ecological footprint? Or is anyone going through currently a phase? I went through a phase too. I still think it's interesting, but the more I've learned about it, the more I've gone, But it's great for hypothesis testing because of how comprehensive it is. So this was a study that was published in one of our flagship disciplinary journals. So that was a big deal for environmental sociologists, to have something published like this in a flagship sociology journal. Cross-sectional OLS regression, because at the time this is the best we could do. So it's like cross-sectional versus longitudinal analyses. I'm a terrible dancer. But you could film me, it's kind of longitudinal, and you realize you are a lousy dancer. But if you took a picture of me and I could be tripping, I might look like I'm a really cool dancer doing a fancy dancing move. Just to illustrate the difference between what cross-sectional snapshot data can look like versus longitudinal data. At the time, this is the best we could do, or the best these researchers could do. And so this was also, how many of you are familiar with STIRPAT? The STIRPAT model, derived out of IPAT. So this was really advancing. This is with Tom Dietz and Jean Rosa, really advancing STIRPAT, similar to some other models, Achaia, identity, and those sorts of things, which has become, it's widely used. And they found that population and affluence are primary drivers of the total footprints of nations. Makes a lot of sense. And then they, lined that up against a bunch of other things derived from a bunch of theories, and they concluded, yeah, population affluence, regardless of what else you throw in the models, really, really matter. It sounds simple and obvious, but it's really important. And it's really, I think, helped to set the stage for a lot of work that's done by sociologists and scholars in other disciplines. So this is a big deal in bringing environmental sociology more to the center of our discipline, but also, I think, helping to advance sort of an approach that I think it's safe to say has been adopted by and used by scholars across many disciplines. But it's cross-sectional. So, and using national level data. Here's an example of a longitudinal study done by one of my PhD students who he's analyzing U.S. state level data. It's a longitudinal state level analysis across all 50 U.S. states, sort of trying to decompose the environment development relationship. Like, what's development anyway? There are big debates about what is development, how do you measure it. I'd be happy to talk about that tomorrow for sure. And there are debates about growth and degrowth and labor and work and all these things. The focus of this study was to look at how working hours in different sorts of contexts might impact carbon emissions, net of a bunch of things, using longitudinal methods. Two-way fixed effects models, to be specific, which is a technique that I'm a big fan of when you have longitudinal data. It's a method that's really popular with political scientists and economists too. It leads to very conservative hypothesis testing most of the time, if you do it without violating assumptions. Okay, so they found higher working hours measured in a couple of different ways, higher state-level carbon emissions, net of a variety of other things that really matter too, that I'd be happy to talk about. But this is longitudinal. But over 2007 to 2013, so maybe a little bit of this, but not a lot of this, due to data limitations. Also, right after these data, the CO2 data were obtained from the EPA database website went dark. It's kind of made things hard for some of us. But God bless librarians, if you know what I'm saying. And I'm married to one, but God bless librarians for what they've been doing in terms of archiving data. Which makes replication difficult when people email you and ask you, I'd like to replicate your study. You were using publicly available data that are no longer publicly available, by the way. It's kind of a dilemma for a lot of us, if you know what I'm saying. And if you don't know what I'm saying, ask somebody. And I mean that just for purely objective science reasons. This is a serious problem. Okay. When you can increase your temporality, relationships might change through time. Surprise, surprise, right? So when you have a lot of longitudinal data and you have basic questions like, what are the effects of economic development on carbon emissions for different categories of nations? And does that relationship perhaps change through time? If you have longitudinal data, you can pursue those kinds of questions. And this is anyone familiar with the decoupling debates, the big decoupling debates? It's really about sustainable development. Can economic growth continue and decouple from energy use and carbon emissions? So this is like a sociological version of asking that kind of question. Using production-based CO2 data from 1960 to 2005, using two-way fixed effects models and employing statistical interactions basically just between time and our standard measure of development, a bunch of interactions using tests of statistical significance to estimate if the effects of development on emissions change through time. For a category of what we're defining as developed nations or global north nations, we have these different terms. They're debated. Where do you draw the line? Versus a larger sample of developing or global south nations. And these numbers here are the elasticity coefficients for each time point, just based upon these models. And I also want to acknowledge that folks in other disciplines are so much better at graphing things than sociologists. We have a lot to learn. And reviewers actually asked us to do this. And I was like, what a dopey idea. And then we tried it. I'm like, oh my Lord, it makes such a difference in terms of people being able to make sense of this, for sure. But yeah, okay. I'm happy to talk about this substantive if you want, but a better example of this, too, is you might be thinking, Andrew, I don't like this macro comparative stuff, and how dare you have a category of high-income nations versus the rest of the world? That's not very nuanced. You keep saying context matters. So what about looking at different regional samples and asking similar sorts of questions? So actually in a study that Professor Givens and I did a few years ago, using consumption-based carbon emissions data instead, we asked a related question. It's more of a sort of a sustainability question, where the dependent variable is the carbon intensity of well-being. It's a ratio between carbon emissions and average life expectancy at birth. I'm going to talk about that more in depth tomorrow in terms of what that is and what it can and can't do for you. But asking, does development impact the carbon intensity of well-being for nations in different regional contexts? And does that relationship change through time? So if you have enough data on enough cases and you have enough longitudinal data, you can split things up this way. And so these lines here in different shades, different colors, represent the estimated effects of GDP per capita on the consumption-based carbon intensity well-being for a sample of OECD nations, so it's not regionally defined, I'm sorry. But for non-OECD nations in Asia, non-OECD nations in Latin America, and non-OECD nations in Africa. From a sustainability perspective, I would politely say that we'd like to see these lines going down, ideally. They're not. But it raises a whole host of new questions that I'm going to talk about tomorrow. But just the relevance of regional context and temporal context, and using modeling techniques when you have longitudinal data to do this. And somewhat better, but basic graphing techniques. We're getting better. We're trying to get better in sociology at this. I'm going to shift gears a little bit, though. This is from Larry Hamilton. Some of you might have some of his methods books. Do we have any Stata users in the room that have loved using Stata or have suffered using Stata? I know some of you use Stata, at least in It's a statistical analysis application. I like it better than a lot of the others. So he's a sociologist. He's a brilliant methodologist. I have like 8 of his methods books on my shelf, and they're really good. They're very applied. He does really cool stuff. He also does public opinion research. He's at University of New Hampshire. So he's been involved in studying climate change beliefs. And one of the really neat things that he's done is looked at how temperature anomalies might affect attitudes about climate change for folks that self-identify as Democrat, Republican, or something else, emphasizing other kinds of context, like temperatures. And what he and his colleagues have found, looking at a sample in New Hampshire, is, and this is using logistic regression. So it's the dependent variable is something as simple as, do you believe that climate change is anthropogenic or not? Sort of yes or no, like a basic kind of question. And oftentimes that question is not constructed in such a simplistic way. But this is a binary outcome, so logistic regression is used. But you can see, though, these are predicted probabilities, and this is graphed out nicely. So even when there's temperature anomalies, those that self-identify as Republican in this sample from New Hampshire, it doesn't really change what they say. They're just much more likely to say that they don't believe that climate change is anthropogenic. But Democrats, too, up here, whether sort of very recent temperature anomalies don't affect them either. So that we have this sort of gap that we hear a lot about. I don't think we can ignore the politics behind this, but anyway. But for those that identify as independent, it does appear to change their views pretty immediately, close to real time, emphasizing this kind of context, shifting temperatures, and how that might influence this relationship between political party identification and whether or not someone says they believe in climate change anthropogenic or not. His work is really cool. I think this is just one of many examples of the work that he does that I highly recommend his stuff. Larry Hamilton. And he's also about the nicest person ever, and he loves to rock climb. So when he heard I was coming, he was like, oh yeah, I've taken many trips out to Logan, and he told me about all the rock climbing up your canyon. Okay, multi-level analysis. Nested data. For those of you that do ecological work, you're dealing with all sorts of messy, nested data, big time. And we are in sociology too. Maybe not as messy as what a lot of you in the room are dealing with, but I think the textbook way that social scientists tend to think about this as students nested within classrooms, nested within schools, nested within districts, for example. So you see this employed a lot actually in educational research like that. And we could think of different levels of nested data. Something like this, or something like this that I've been playing around with some colleagues. using regression modeling techniques where the math is very similar to longitudinal analysis techniques. If you're into the math behind this, it's quite similar. So I'm going to embarrass Jennifer, Professor Gibbons. So prior to her dissertation work, she had mentioned when she was introducing me, she was very kind and said that I've done work on the global dimensions of environmental concern. I would like to respectfully correct that statement. She has, and she allowed me to come along for the ride while she was doing it. So analyzing individual level data from samples of individuals in 37 different nations, she was interested in these macro-micro linkages, engaging different big macro theories in sociology that I won't go into detail now, but about how different global civil society characteristics of different kinds or different global economic kinds of characteristics might to some extent influence all the way down to the individual level attitudes about the environment. So it's multi-level data, national level data, and individual level data. And we know that a lot of individual level characteristics explain variation in attitudes about things, including attitudes about the environment. So this is all the individual level stuff. And all this stuff really matters in ways much more complicated than this. But what motivated this kind of study, though, was asking these macro level questions. And Jennifer found that in nations that have a stronger presence of environmental NGOs of different kinds, those are places where you're more likely to see individuals expressing concern for the environment, which I think is pretty interesting. You can think about this from the global to the local, from the local to the global, and also looking at some other macro level characteristics. Here's a different example of multi-level analysis that's a bit different. This is from a study that my colleagues and I did where the dependent variable are fossil-fueled power plants in the 25 transition economy nations in Central and Eastern Europe and Eurasia. So the dependent variable is plant-level carbon emissions for just fossil-fueled power plants. And we're interested in sort of a basic question. For these nations that have become members of the European Union, because of the different directives being involved in the EU tied to energy and climate change, does that have an observable impact on plant-level emissions? Meaning, is it leading to a reduction in facility-level emissions? And we also know, and for those of you in the room that are in engineering, you know that there's all sorts of engineering things that really matter that we're accounting for. Capacity utilization rate, fuel input, size, age, all sorts of things, as well as some organizational characteristics about these facilities, and then looking at some national level things. Like among these nations that have joined the European Union, those that have joined recently versus those that have been a member longer, do you see an observable effect of that duration of membership on plant level emissions? Meaning, if they're a member of the EU, are plant level emissions lower? And is duration of membership also beneficial? And the answer is yes and yes, which I think is really encouraging, that these sorts of policies somehow make a difference. How do they make a difference? We're not sure yet. We're trying to figure that out. This was step one. But we're able to identify this set of relationships that we're hoping to see this way, but now we need to do a deep dive into it, which is what we're in the middle of doing. So another example of multi-level stuff. Two very different things, both done by sociologists. Okay. Path analysis, a simplified version of SEM. And I don't mean that in a flippant way, because I've used this technique a lot. When I was in graduate school, I fell in love with this technique because I thought, all these theories we have are all about all these indirect effects. This is an ideal method for analyzing direct and indirect effects. And you can have like a conceptual model, a theoretical model, where the arrows might tell the story. Then you want to test whether or not these arrows are legitimate using path analysis. I thought some of you might find this example interesting. It's a brand new study done by some sociologists at Kansas State, looking at that big aquifer in that part of the country, where they have a conceptual model, and they're looking at groundwater consumption, and they're looking at growth in certain kinds of efficiencies versus growth, just the expansion of water use, to see what happens to overall groundwater consumption. And their findings are very complicated. This context really matters. Increasing efficiencies have beneficial effects that you like to see, but those benefits, to some extent, are kind of not fully outstripped, but some of the benefits are sort of washed out just by the overall growth of this sector. These challenges between efficiencies versus growth and scale in the context of groundwater consumption in this aquifer. And this is done by sociologists, whether you think they're doing it right or not. He actually got his PhD, coincidentally, at the University of Utah a long time ago. Don't hate him for that, please. He's a really nice guy. He's at Kansas State. His name's Matt Sanderson. Or some of you might remember Sandy Market Pyatt. She used to be here at Utah State in sociology. I'm not trying to say that like she used to be here, but she's not anymore. She still loves this place. She just moved for family reasons. She's a brilliant methodologist using more sophisticated SEM techniques, and she does a lot of attitudinal research. So we know that when we're analyzing attitudes about things, we're trying to measure something like climate action or what it means to contribute in different sorts of ways or beliefs, that it's really difficult to use one measurement, one variable to operationalize these concepts, like the strength of SEM models, which is much more nuanced than this. This is just really a more sophisticated version of this. And her work is awesome. She actually taught me this method at an ICPSR course that she teaches. And she's a sociologist too. I mentioned event history analysis, Cox regression. You called it something else. I forgot what you...
Failure time analysis.
Failure time analysis. Thank you. And I sort of gave part of the takeaway away, but you can study this. You can use this to study things like treaty ratification. So on the one hand, a lot of health research use this method, but folks in political science and in sociology, for example, that study the ratification of treaties can also use this technique quite effectively. So Professor Gibbons, a few years ago, used this technique to analyze Kyoto Protocol ratification. It analyzes how long it might take for a case or a nation to ratify or not ratify, asking particular questions that might surprise some of you in terms of her findings. She was really focusing actually on power in the context of military power and operationalizing it multiple ways to see whether or not military power might influence how long it takes a nation to ratify Kyoto. That doesn't matter. You found it matters using this technique. And I really like to use this too because when Jennifer was in graduate school, if you're not familiar with the sociology department at the University of Utah, there's a lot of health researchers that use this technique for studying mortality. And then there's folks like Jennifer that are employing that same method to look at something like the ratification of treaties. And if you want a thorough explanation like why does it matter, ask Jennifer. Okay, I'm almost done. Thought I'd talk a little bit about network analysis. It's been around a while. It's really catching fire now, as well as other techniques that I won't talk about, like big data, computational methods for purposes of time. And I know that this is a technique that, or there are a variety of network analysis techniques that are employed across different disciplines. Sociologists use this a lot. I mean, a lot of the stuff about sociology is about relationships at multiple scales. So it allows you to analyze, initially descriptively, relationships between different nodes or actors within these different kinds of network contexts. It could be individuals, it could be at the group level, it could be at the nation-state level, whatever. And some would argue that in a network like this, maybe node A is more influential than these other nodes, whatever they are, because of the network structure. It also depends on what these connections are, for sure. It's a really interesting technique. So some of you might have seen this study in Nature Climate Change a few years ago. The authors are sociologists studying what we call echo chambers in climate change policy. They're much better with their visualization, much prettier stuff. And also, nature journals have that expectation. And if you were wondering if echo chambers exist in policy networks, the short answer is yes, they do. And they have an insane amount of network data to support that proposition. I highly recommend taking a look at the study if you haven't seen it. And they're doing a lot of follow-up work now. And they're sociologists. Okay, the last method I'm going to talk about, qualitative comparative analysis. It's not really a qualitative method. It's not really a quantitative method. I don't really know what to call it. It uses Boolean algebra. What I like about it, though, is this notion of equifinality. It allows you to look at what some of us might refer to as different structural configurations or more complex interactions. And I like to use a certain basic analogy. Imagine you went to a friend's house and they baked a loaf of bread, and you took a slice and you went, my goodness, that is the best bread I've ever eaten in my life. I want the recipe, please. And they say, okay. But then they throw down 5 different pieces of paper. And they say, here's 5 different recipes. Some of them have similar ingredients, some of them have different ingredients. But all 5 of these recipes will give you exactly this same beautiful loaf of bread. This is what qualitative comparative analysis can help you do, in a nutshell. A really cool example of using this method in a way that I think balances out some of the strengths and limitations of macro-level research and more field-based methods. I'm sure some of you are familiar with Tom Rudell's work on land cover change. He recently retired. He was in the Human Ecology School at Rutgers. He's a sociologist by training. So he, which ended up being this book, with a bunch of graduate students, did a meta-analysis of all the field work on land cover change. Okay, and they had this amazing coding exercise that they did for a number of years. Because that context really matters. Then they coded all those data and used qualitative comparative analyses, and the results clearly showed that there are these regionally sort of based configurations that are unique to different regions that explain land cover change, deforestation in different places, that are unique to regional specificity. That context really matters. So some things that matter over here, a certain combination of factors that matter over here, don't necessarily matter over here. Some of these things that matter over here might matter over here, but it's a different set of combinations that do. So it balances out the general and the particular and the importance of context. I'm running out of time, so I'll skip over this example. I'll just say that tomorrow I'm going to talk about how my colleagues and I are combining qualitative comparative analysis with multi-level regression to study really what the same idea about different structural configurations to look at plant-level emissions for fossil fuel power plants in like 160 nations all over the world, combining QCA with multi-level regression. So just to wrap up, this was not at all exhaustive, and I'm sure I skipped over some of your favorite methods like spatial analysis techniques. Sociologists use spatial analysis techniques, but not as well as our friends in geography. I mean, some of us do. We're getting better, but I just couldn't cover everything. Or computational methods, big data. A few things I want to emphasize. The methods we use, they're diverse. Our discipline's really diverse. Environmental sociology, we really embrace methodological pluralism. I think our discipline as a whole embraces methodological pluralism, but within the environmental sociology community, we really do. It's one of the things that I love about our little community that's embedded in the broader sustainability community. I think that's pretty much all I'll say. I was going to mention, though, the importance of this. And we have all these fancy methods, but what's the use if we don't do this well? And this is something that sociologists are thinking a lot about, too. How can we translate or more effectively communicate our work in ways that are more accessible to folks in the academy outside of our silo, but especially outside of these academic boundaries. Because I know that I'm at a point in my career that that is what's most important. So thanks. Thanks for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions now or later. I love feedback, criticisms, all that kind of stuff. Thanks for coming. I know I think I went a little long. I could have talked for another 2 hours. Easy. I can if you want me to. Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to come up to you if you don't mind. In case you want others to hear, but I just want to make sure.
I'm an ecologist. Maybe that's an ecologist.
Yeah.
Intrigued by the way you chose to frame your discipline.
Okay.
And I'm wondering whether you would say that the biggest advances in environmental sociology are coming from advances in methods or advances in, say, theory.
Ouch. A colleague up here, I think, had a pretty good response that I think may not surprise you. Dan Auerbach, who you two should meet, you're just down the street from each other, said, it probably depends on who you ask, for sure. I would say that I think our unique contributions overall perhaps might be more theoretical than methodological, because I'm hoping that these methods that I talked about are very familiar to you, meaning that these aren't methods that are unique to the discipline. Maybe some of the ways in which we are using some of these methods or tweaking some of these methods might be unique and new to you. So that's, I think, a contribution or a set of contributions. I do think, and I didn't talk about theory. For me, both methods and theory are tools. Not everyone in sociology agrees with that. I was also trained by, when I was in graduate school, by really kind of grumpy theorists that said theories are only useful if they're testable. Now, my guess is a lot of you in the room would agree with that, and some of you might not fully agree with that or might fully disagree with that in terms of what is the role of theory. For me, I'm motivated by problems. Like, I was drawn to all this because I think, like a lot of you, I'm really interested in studying relationships between people and non-human species and the natural world and all that kind of stuff. And I'm really worried about how things have been going. And so I like to use both theory and methods as tools to make sense of all of that. So I don't privilege one over the other, but some people do, because some folks are, like, I'm not a theorist. I would never claim to be a theorist. I have friends that are serious theorists, and I get to collaborate with them sometimes. So fortunately, they're good at that stuff. So for me, they're both tools that are really important. They're interrelated. Good research can lead to better theory developments, redevelopments, all that kind of stuff. I'm trying to really specifically answer your question, which one wins? Is there a winner? I'm really reluctant to say, but I think that most folks would probably say that our unique contributions overall have probably been mostly theoretical and substantive. But what I would like to emphasize, though, is the plurality of methods that we use. Most of us are driven by using research methods as tools and recognizing that depending on what your research question is, that should guide what your research design is and what methods you use, which I think is just the logic of doing good research. And also, increasingly, the importance of, whether it's called triangulation, we like to call it multi-method work in environmental sociology, that's becoming more important too. And for a lot of the things that we study, though, I primarily use quantitative methods in my research. But to make sense of my findings, though, I heavily rely on a lot of the rich, inductive, ethnographic, and historical case study work to try to make sense of these fancy models that I run, or somewhat fancy models that I run. So I don't think some methods are superior to others, but I will say, though, that earlier in my career, like others, I had my opinions. It's oh yeah, these methods are better than those because they're generalizable and blah, blah, blah. It's I've learned my lesson. That was, no. That's just not good science. I don't want to say more than that about, because that's a really good question, though. Thank you. I've never been asked that specific question before, but I was really struck by your immediate response, though, that it really depends on who you might ask within our community, or people outside of the community that might be trying to make some sense of what it is that we've been doing. What are you familiar with any of the environmental sociology work? Or is this pretty new to you? Oh, that's cool. I mean, I could tell you a story like about a year and a half ago, a really nice reporter contacted me and asked me about some stuff that a big group of environmental sociologists did, like other scholars and disciplines. We felt very strongly about making a public statement about our concerns about what was going on in a lot of federal agencies. So we made our statement, like a lot of other groups did. You know, environmental sociologists concerned about what's going on at the EPA. And a very accomplished, super smart reporter whose work I read a lot gave me a call. So I was super excited because I was fanning out like, oh my gosh, this is really cool. And they want to, it's like, oh, you want to maybe publicize sociologist statements about this. Great. One of the very first questions she asked me was, don't be offended, but what in the world is environmental sociology? I've never heard of this before. At first I went, but then I realized that is such a great question. And it's so easy to get caught up in your bubble, right? And it really shook me. And I realized, most folks don't know and perhaps haven't been exposed to this. Or maybe they didn't realize that they read things that were environmental sociology. But actually, in a way, if you have read work that's been authored by sociologists, and you didn't necessarily know it was authored by sociologists, but you found it useful, and you told me that, I would be thrilled, whether you knew it was sociologists or not, just given the importance of doing this sort of multidisciplinary work and breaking down these sort of disciplinary boundaries, which are important. I think a lot of you are getting graduate degrees. You have to have that specialization. It's super important, for sure. But from what I've learned about the Ecology Center and the history behind it and what motivates why this exists and how it's so student-centered, though, is to sort of balance out that discipline-specific expertise with breaking down those boundaries simultaneously. And it's really hard to do. And a lot of places talk about doing it. Everyone has their talk about it. This place has been doing it for a long time, and that's really cool. So I'm kind of envious that you all have this. I didn't have it when I was in graduate school. And I went to a pretty cool university too, but this is really neat. Yeah?
I was wondering if you could provide some examples from the cutting edge of environmental sociology about how this field has contributed to finding solutions to sustainability issues.
Okay. We have a great track record. First, I want to ask, who in here self-identifies as a sociologist? It's interesting. The folks like, I don't know if I want to answer this. Yeah. So I saw a lot of like, well, yeah, okay. So this is just, I'm only speaking for myself. So others might. I think we have a long track record of identifying or focusing on what causes these problems. Like I mentioned before, problems-oriented things that I study. And it can be really depressing. I think that like other disciplines and other subfields within disciplines, I think we've struggled as we've grown and evolved and become more established to shift our focus more so in balancing out with identifying problems. I'm really good at that, or I'm okay at that. But then going from that to okay to the next point. So now that we think we have an idea about what might be causing some of this stuff, or partly, what do we do about it? I think we have a long ways to go. What I would say, though, is it's something that I think it's safe to say within the environmental sociology community, but also in the sociology community more broadly, we're taking very seriously. We have this way of defining a lot of ourselves as public sociologists, which means a lot of different things. To some people, it means being scholar activists. To some folks, it means doing more translational research. To some folks, it means moving beyond this is how we're screwing things up. What do we do about it? The challenge for me personally, because I'm at a point in my career where I really want to do that better, is I feel like I have a lot of learning to do because that's not what I was trained to do in graduate school. And that's also something that has really influencing how I'm trying to work with graduate students now that are coming into the field. So I like the fact that our focus is shifting, but I think that we still have a ways to go. And I'm being pretty critical. I'm probably being overly critical. Because if you even looked at that book that I put up in the very beginning, like our paperback book on sociological research on climate change, co-authored by a bazillion people on a bunch of different things, we have chapters on adaptation and governance and those sorts of things too. They're really more focused on solutions. But they're not the majority of the chapters. We have more chapters on drivers, justice, inequality. How are we screwing things up for the environment and for people? So, sister and brother sociologists, is that a pretty, have I offended you? I think that's a pretty critical way of putting it. But I would also like to think that folks in sister disciplines, if they were being honest with themselves, might have something similar to say. But yeah, I think that someone this morning asked me about, a lot of the stuff we do or a lot of the things you do seem really depressing. So how do you not get, crazy depressed? And I'm more optimistic now than I used to be. And I've done this for a while now. And I think that part of it is because of that shift. And it's also something that I think more about in terms of in the classroom, the discussions I want to have with undergrads and grads in different sorts of ways. And also, their interest in that, I think, is becoming more pronounced. It's certainly, I think, more so than I remember when I was an undergrad drawn to this, when I took an environmental sociology class by Tom Burns at the University of Utah a long time ago. And I was drawn to we can study how we're screwing up the environment part. And I was really drawn to that. Because I really I was really just, it caught me emotionally. I'm like, oh, this is something I really care about. And you can study that as a sociologist? Cool. Because before that, I'd taken courses in deviance, race, class, and gender. I loved all that stuff. But when I took that class, I was sold. I'm like, for better, for worse, I want to figure out how to do that. But I was motivated by the problems part too. And so that's what I pursued early on. But I'm more optimistic now. Students make me more optimistic, and I think how perhaps we're shifting how we're training students. The other thing that a lot of us are really lousy at, though, is translating our work. We all have our specialized language. And we try to break that down in this kind of setting, this kind of environment across disciplines, which is wonderful. I'm still trying to get better and better, though, at how do I communicate to folks outside of the academy about what we do and why should they care and not make them feel lost. It's like, you study climate change. That's this big, huge thing. I'm one person. Disconnect. I'm just going to go over here and worry about something else. Because I think we need to get better at that. And to be perfectly honest, I'm still trying to figure out how to do that better. But I think it's something that students are increasingly more interested in trying to figure out how to do better. So thank you, because I think you're one of those folks.
Is there one more question? Then we can let Dr. Jorgenson, or if there aren't, let's
call me Andrew.
Give Andrew a hand, and hopefully you can come to dinner and ask him any further questions you have. Thanks.
Well, thanks.